Greetings! In this video I would like to explore the concept of consistency of gameplay mechanics and how value in consistency can inform your decision making as a game developer. This video can be divided in several sections. The first one will be a short reiteration of my Malenia analysis, but with more accurate terminology. I will explain the mechanics of stagger and stance break and show how Malenia breaks them. And then the second part of the video will explore inconsistencies of stance break in other bosses. The actual main thesis of this video will start later, so if you're not particularly interested in how stagger or stance break work, you can skip to this timestamp. On the other hand, even if you end up disagreeing with every opinion I present, you might still learn something new from all the research I did. While I will use Elden Ring and Dark Souls as examples, the points that I will bring up can apply to any game. Okay, let's begin then. Enemies get staggered whenever they are hit by an attack with an appropriate damage level, as it's called internally by the game. Curved Sword has a damage level of 1, while staggering an Omen requires damage level of 2 or higher. Colossal Sword has a damage level of 3. If an enemy can be staggered by different damage levels, the duration of that stagger will depend on that damage level. Different enemies may stagger for different durations from the same attack. But what's important is that if you use the same attack on the same enemy, the stagger duration will always be the same. Enemies cannot begin an animation before stagger wears off. Staggering the enemy while they are already in the stagger animation reapplies the stagger duration of the second attack. Hyper Armor is a mechanic that allows enemies to ignore stagger from attacks that would otherwise stagger them. Hyper Armor is usually applied to a section of a specific animation, commonly referred to as Hyper Armor frames. What's important to understand is that Hyper Armor does not prevent stance breaks from occurring. So, what is stance break and how does it work? Along with a visible HP bar, there is another bar that, when depleted, triggers stance break. Internally, the game refers to it as poise. Normally that bar is invisible, but I am using a tool that displays enemy poise, as well as the timer before poise starts to regenerate. Pay attention to the poise bar at the bottom. Normally, if poise goes below 0, the enemy should experience stance break, and the poise should reset to full. So, Malenia can be staggered even with light attacks that have damage level of 1, like a curved sword. And using heavier weapons, like a great sword with damage level of 2, does stagger her for longer. But for some reason, damage level 3 inflicts the stagger of the same duration as damage level 2. Which is already an inconsistency, but not really a big issue, unlike what I'm about to show next. If Malenia gets staggered by an attack with damage level 1, she can sometimes cancel that stagger, almost completely nullifying its duration. She has 3 animations she can cancel into. 2 of them are exclusive to phase 1, while the last one is exclusive to phase 2. First one is this blocking or parrying animation, which she can chain into actual attacks. And yes, it does have blocking frames. The other phase 1 animation is this spinning dash. And in phase 2 she can cancel the stagger into this clockwise kick attack, which basically disallows the use of numerous multi-hit attacks that may have damage level 1 on the first hit. On top of that, Malenia is able to ignore the event of stance break if you hit her during Hyper Armor frames. If the stance break is ignored, the poise isn't reset like it should be, and instead starts to gradually regenerate. The fact that it starts regenerating might be a bug, but what's important is that seeing poise in the negatives allows us to identify examples of stance break immunity, as I will call it. Another thing that might be a bug, although I'm not entirely sure it is the fact that her first phase cannot be killed with a critical attack. This also applies to damage you deal to her while she is standing up after a critical attack. You can repeat this parry riposte cycle infinitely if you want. In order to start her second phase, you have to damage her outside of the critical state. The reason I'm not sure it's a bug is that she also cannot die while in the air during the very first Scarlet Aeonia she does, at the start of phase 2, which has to be deliberate. In practice, this isn't going to affect you, because you're not going to one-shot her while she's still in the air, but combined with all the other stuff, this really does feel like preferential treatment. And also, you can actually one-shot her using in-game means. Credit to Inferno Plus for this clip, as well as for discovering this feature of Malenia. Now that we are done with recapping how Malenia deviates from established mechanics, there is a valid question to be asked. Is she the only one who does this? And the answer to that question is twofold. First of all, she definitely isn't the first boss in the history of gaming to break established rules, as I may have accidentally implied in my analysis. More on this later in the video. But as far as bosses in Elden Ring go, she is the only one who can cancel staggers. However, stance break immunity isn't actually exclusive to her. Bosses who have phase transition animations also have stance break immunity during that time. Another exception is Renala, who is immune during her full moon attack and when summoning spirits. We can try to rationalize this by classifying these animations as signature attacks. Basically animations that, besides gameplay aspects, have high cinematic value. I think this is a sensible exception to the base mechanic of stance break, if this exception remains consistent throughout the game. It would have been consistent if Malenia only had stance break immunity on her signature attacks, Waterfowl Dance and Scarlet Aeonia. But what makes Malenia different is that she ignores stance break during every hyper armor animation, and everyone who has fought her knows how many hyper armor animations she has. And as I have already shown, hyper armor does not prevent stance break. But I can show this again, taking Renala as an example, as she also has several hyper armor animations. Those animations are the backstep that she sometimes does after exiting stagger, the Comet Azure Beam, Spirit Summoning, and the aforementioned Moon Attack. However, she can be stance broken during the beam and the backstep, which once again means that the source of stance break immunity is not the hyper armor. And both the Moon Attack and the Summoning animation can be classified as signature attacks. The problem is that Godskin Noble can be stance broken during his signature attacks. And neither of Godskins is immune to stance break during phase transitions. At the same time, Godskin Apostle cannot be stance broken during attacks that extend his torso. And you could say that those are his signature attacks, but I think it's a stretch. So, on top of the poise HP being hidden from the player, and stance break immunity already being a deviation from a base rule, it's not even done in a consistent manner. Actually, before we go further, let's play a little game. I'm going to display a timer that will count down to the moment a boss is hit by an attack that should result in stance break, and you will try to guess if it actually does. To really hammer home the point of how inconsistently all of this works, tell me in the comments how many you managed to guess correctly. This only gets worse, because this game actually features another form of stance break immunity, which functions differently from the one I've shown up to this point. Morgoth, during his phase transition, is immune to poise damage as a whole, which by extension means that he is immune to stance break during that animation. Hitting him in this state also doesn't refresh poise reset timer, which allows poise to start regenerating. This system is also shared by Malenia during his aerial attacks. But to be honest, stance break immunity during aerial attacks does make sense, as bosses falling out of the sky would look quite silly. So let's look at aerial attacks of other bosses. Yeah, Radagon just doesn't have immunity. Let's look at Elden Beast, and probably the most cinematic attack in the game. Yeah, you can interrupt that one as well. Let's check a boss that definitely has stance break immunity. Radahn has two phase transition animations that cannot be interrupted. And since he has stance break immunity at all, maybe he has it on his aerial attacks as well. Or maybe he doesn't. Okay, so what about Godfrey? Both of his phases have two distinct sub-phases, complete with uninterruptible transition animations. So it works here but not with Radahn. What about Placidus Axe? He has stance break immunity on his phase transition too. So maybe some of his attacks also benefit from it. Apparently not. Forgive me if I'm taking too long to get to the actual point of all of this testing, but it is important to highlight the inconsistency in gameplay design. If it's possible to stance break Elden Beast or Placidus Axe during their supposedly super powerful attacks, why is Malenia immune to it during simple dashes? Why are Malekith and Godfrey immune during their jumps, but you can knock Elden Beast and Radahn and Placidus Axe out of the sky? And also, why do some bosses have invulnerability frames during their attacks? Here's another test, with Fire's Deadly Sin and Black Flame Tornado for a constant hitbox that's impossible to pass through without taking damage. And Placidus Axe isn't the only one who does that either. In practice, this also gives those animations immunity to stance break. So, to summarize, you have a game mechanic, stance break, and then you have three different ways bosses can ignore it, which are applied almost completely arbitrarily. The reason I say it's arbitrary is because this flying animation that Mohg has consists of two parts, and only the second part gets iframes, while the first one gets absolutely nothing. On top of that, Mohg also takes 15% less poise damage during the entire phase 2, so now poise damage negation is a thing as well. Lanciax also has it, and she resists 80% of the poise damage. So if you ever wondered why it's so hard to stance break her, this is why. She does take increased poise damage to the head though, which is true for other dragons and other enemies as well, so at least this is consistent. Also, Mohg restores some of his poise during the phase transition. If we try to rationalize this by linking it to him restoring his normal HP as well, then by this logic Malenia should also restore her poise when healing, but she doesn't. Dragonkin Soldier of Nextella, on the other hand, resets his poise during the phase transition. Twice. Most likely because the actual entity you're fighting gets swapped for some reason. If you do not view consistency as something valuable, then you are most likely wondering why any of this is an issue at all. After all, it doesn't affect gameplay in a meaningful way, but consistency is a very important aspect of game design, mostly responsible for creating player expectations. It isn't untouchable though, but it has value, and every deviation is a trade-off of that value for something else. If you, as a game developer, decide to subvert a mechanic you established in order to achieve some goal, you are sacrificing consistency to do it. And so it would be wise to ask yourself, is this the best way to achieve that goal? Is there a way to damage consistency less? Is there a way to compensate for the damage done? Allow me to give you an example from Dark Souls 3. The final boss of that game, Soul of Cinder, the one you're seeing in the background, has a 5-hit combo that launches you in the air with subsequent swings keeping you airborne. An interesting fact about that combo is that every swing beyond the first will damage you through the iframes of your roll. The reason for it is simple. Normally when you get launched, you get iframes while in the air. That obviously would prevent the follow-up swings from hitting you. And so the simplest, laziest solution was to make those attacks ignore iframes. All iframes. The consistency of one of the most core mechanics of the game, invulnerability frames and rolls, was disregarded in order to achieve the desired effect of how this attack should function. If you do not value consistency, you will not feel compelled to come up with better solutions that may not require you to sacrifice game mechanics. For example, what if this specific attack did not give you iframes upon getting launched? The end result is exactly the same for the player who actually gets hit by this attack, but the player who relied on the knowledge that rolling provides iframes has now successfully avoided the damage. In this case, the consistency of iframes from launching attacks was sacrificed. But wouldn't you agree that it is less important than iframes from rolling? Another example is Artorias from Dark Souls 1. He ignores iframes with his front flip attacks. The reason could be the same as with Soul of Cinder, to allow a combo to happen where normally it would have been prevented by knockdown iframes. Or it could have been done to discourage rolling forward or back instead of to the sides, out of the way of the sword. Regardless, it is done at a cost of the core mechanic of the game. Another way to discourage rolling forward or back would be to make this attack simply have a thin lingering hitbox. If the player rolls forward or back, they would be caught by that hitbox. This solution is far from ideal, because unintuitive lingering hitboxes can be extremely annoying. But the attack could be altered to have some visible shockwave to communicate the existence of that hitbox to the player. And it accomplishes the same goal without actually damaging any mechanic. A scenario of iframes being ignored, which I actually find perfectly sensible, is being hit by environmental hazards. Examples of that also include Carthus Catacombs Skeleton Ball in Dark Souls 3, as well as Sense Fortress boulders in Dark Souls 1. But even though this exception is reasonable, roughly the same result could have been achieved without breaking any mechanics. Player can still physically collide with an enemy, and if that enemy is moving, it can push the player along, keeping them inside the hitbox so that the player gets hit right as the iframes end. Same concept could have been applied to the chariots, and it would have achieved the same goal, making rolling through the hazards unviable. Circling back to Malenia and her stagger cancelling. If the goal was to show her resilience by making her shrug off the staggers from light weapons, why not make her immune to those staggers like many other enemies are? Or her stagger from damage level 1 could have been simply shorter by default, for example 10 frames instead of 25, but always 10 frames. And if the stagger cancelling has to stay, then some effort should be made to try and legitimize it as an actual unique mechanic, rather than an existing mechanic not working properly. One way to do this is by communicating this deviation to the player in a clear way. Player needs to understand that this specific animation is not just a random attack, but a direct result of the player hitting Malenia. Closest existing mechanic is guard counters. The actual counterattack cannot happen without getting hit first. Now, obviously, in case of guard counters, the hit is absorbed by the shield. But the point of comparison is that it is a mechanic that links the cause and effect of a received hit and the counterattack animation. Playing guard counter sound effect whenever Malenia cancels the stagger could communicate that link to the player. While not a perfect solution, I think it's better than nothing we have right now. And as for stance breaking, I think that the game could benefit from it working in a consistent way for all enemies. But the rule can still be consistent, as long as the exceptions to that rule are also consistent. For example, immunity during phase transitions seems reasonable to me. As for immunity during special attacks, I think that allowing them to be interrupted besides being consistent with the base mechanic, can also create interesting scenarios for players. For example, Malenia jumps up to start the waterfowl dance, and the player is too late to escape, but feels like she is close to being stance broken, and so the player does one more attack as a last-ditch effort to stop her. Maybe they succeed, maybe they don't, but right now this isn't even an option. Unless of course you're using a bleed or frost build, which just stops Malenia's hyper armor animations regardless. But if those attacks must remain uninterruptible, then all other special attacks I've shown should also be uninterruptible, so that the exception to the rule is clear and consistent. But if it was up to me, I would remove stance break immunity from everything except phase transitions. Otherwise it becomes too difficult to tell what should and shouldn't be classified as a special or signature attack. And clarity is a very important aspect of game design, if not more important than consistency is. Okay, I think it's time to wrap this up. I hope the research I did as well as the perspective I offered was helpful. But before I go, I'll leave you with one more clip. I saved the best one for last. Thank you all for watching, and farewell.